one of the cool things about, good restaurant criticism, you read a review by Pete Wells or by Matthew at New York Magazine or, Robert Sietsema or mild reviews at Eater, is that we like to be in conversation with one another. So many occasions I would disagree with what Pete Wells says, and I would quote his review, and they say, here's why I think he's wrong, or here's how I disagree with them.
This is Taste. I'm your host, Matt Rodbard. For years, Ryan Sutton was the chief restaurant critic at Eater New York, and previous to that served as a critic at Bloomberg. Ryan is one of the most respected critics in the game, and we wanted to invite him to the studio to talk about The Low Times, his Substack covering the New York City restaurant game. We talk about modern pizza by the slice, the economics of sushi, and go over some of his favorite restaurants in this great restaurant city. I loved catching up with Ryan, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Ryan Sutton, welcome back to This Is Taste. It's great to see you.
So great to see you, Matt. Excited to be back and excited to be back in the food media game.
Well, I want to go back to our last conversation, which was February 2023, and I'm going to link to that great interview in the show notes. You had just been laid off from Eater, and you were thinking about your next move. I think it was a real melancholy kind of chat, and I really appreciate you being vulnerable and chatting with us because you really were bummed that you had been laid off from a job that you gave so much to, and I read all the time. But in the last year, you've rebounded. You're back in our world, and I love The Low Times. I think it is, if you live in New York City, you have to subscribe. I'm going to say that, put it on a billboard, use the pull quote. It's absolutely a must read. You're doing the work, Ryan, and I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for saying it. And it's no, I'm lucky that I have it's the Low Times is reviews and guides that I publish on Substack, and I'm lucky that Substack was there to let me do this thing that essentially provides me personally provides me the opportunity to make some bucks for myself in such a fashion where I get to express my voice and develop my voice in the way that I want to, if I can be somewhat selfish about it. But also it allows me kind of to say no to a lot of people who reach out to me to say, hey, do you want to work with us? Because right now, and this is no offense to anyone, freelance rates aren't the greatest right now. And so it allows me to be selective and to keep kind of a roof over my head without having to take something that undervalues my work from a freelance perspective. So that's incredibly grateful for me, both financially and just the ability to keep doing what I love to do. And I've been reviewing restaurants for about 20 years right now. And so the fact that there's this thing out there called Substack that allows me to keep doing that. I mean, Jiminy Crickets, I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, and to remind everybody, you were a critic at Bloomberg for years, and then you were the New York critic at Eater and helped out with a lot of business reporting at Eater as well, and did terrific pieces. So I recommend going back to that 2023 interview where we get more into your history and your time at Eater, because we're going to talk about a lot more things today because you've been having a lot of slices of pizza. So we're going to get into that New York City pizza scene. But I've always enjoyed your tenacious reporting, how you aren't just assessing the restaurant quality, but providing this real zoom out kind of element. And I want to talk about the NYC restaurant scene from a zoom out perspective, because I think you have a lot to say. What are you feeling right now in New York? I mean, are we in a healthy environment? Is it still very much held back and held down by the pandemic and the reality? Of course, one more topic, and this very big question is inflation and the price of dining out, which many people are stunned when they go to restaurants in New York. And but we've had a lot of chefs here, and really, it's not. Like all the chefs are getting rich doing this. So I've thrown out a lot of topics. I'd love to get your take.
A lot to cover there. I think briefly, there's, as always, there's amazingly delicious and inspiring restaurants out in New York City right now, more so than ever, at least more so than since the pandemic. So I think we're in terms of quality and good young and old chefs doing amazing things. I think we're in a good place. But yes, as you hinted at, inflation is still tough. Or maybe let me tweak that. Inflation throughout the economy is reasonably low right now. But just because inflation is low, and inflation, of course, means prices are rising and the purchasing power of the dollar is, a little bit weaker than it used to be. Even though inflation is low, prices are still high. And that's key. The price of drinking a glass of wine or having a cocktail in New York City right now, I would politely describe as prohibitive, unless you're kind of higher middle income. At a good restaurant, a glass of wine is probably going to cost upwards of $15, $16, $17, $18 at a base level. Not uncommon to have martinis in the $21 plus range. And so, eating and drinking out in New York City right now is tough. The prices of a kind of a top-tier omakase, your going rate is about $500 before a single drop of sake is poured. And there are at least 10 of those places right now. And the price of dining out right now in New York is tough both at the high end, but it's also high at kind of the middle to low end when you think of some of New York's best sliced pizzas right now. And again, this is, really good stuff. You're talking about, $5 per slice. And again, this is not a criticism. This is a product of the fact that, flour prices are elevated over the past few years and that labor costs are up as well. And again, nothing wrong with any of these factors. Some of them are just a product of supply chain. Some of them are a product of increasing labor costs because of higher minimum wages. Those are great things too. But it all leads to the fact that if you're an everyday person with an everyday job, everyday things like going to your favorite restaurants are a lot more expensive than they used to be. So that means for a lot of us, we get to do it a little bit less. And so, it is what it is.
Yeah, well said, Ryan. And I have a follow-up. When you're thinking about even like the most simple sandwich shop, pizza slice place, taqueria, and you're paying $30, $40, $50 a person, that's even prohibitive. Is there a model in New York that you feel can keep the prices lower by either having less labor? I know we've spoken with Steve Ells from Chipotle, and now Colonel, his new restaurant, about like lowering the labor footprint. Or is there just like maybe a cuisine, maybe plant-based is better? Again, very big question. I would love to get your take.
I don't think there's, a great question. I don't think there's any magic solution to any of this. I think it's the reality we're all paying more for what we used to pay less for, somewhat tautologically. And, it is what it is. I remember before the pandemic, when the tipped minimum wage rose dramatically right before the pandemic, I anecdotally noticed fewer servers on the floor of any given restaurant. And I think that continued through the pandemic and afterwards. And so, every now and then you're going to see fewer servers on the floor, and you're going to see more venues adopting a kind of a fast casual model where you pay first and get your food later. I don't know necessarily if that's going to become the predominant model because we're lucky if that's the right term, we're lucky in New York to have enough wealthy consumers, huge finance and legal industries here in New York City where a lot of people can truly afford these things. So we'll still have these, upscale restaurants where, dinner for one is going to cost you upwards of $100 to get 3 courses and 2 glasses of wine after tax and tip. But you're going to see more fast casual-ish style restaurants. But I don't think that will ever fully subsume the service industry model of, having a fully serviced front of the house staff, even as the minimum wage continues to go up and even as the tip minimum wage probably eventually completely disappears in New York, which I'm sure it will sometime in the next 10 years, because I feel like that's kind of the national trend as we've seen the tip minimum wage disappear in other cities and municipalities and states as well.
I have to ask you simply, with the idea that we maybe need to dine a little less to afford these prices that are very just with increasing costs, are there too many restaurants in New York City?
Let me look at it more specifically. It seemed for a while that maybe there were too many high-end sushi restaurants. We saw the closure of Ginzo and Adara, and I think another 1 or 2 closed as well. And indeed, if you have like $1 billion, you can get into any of these restaurants on any given night. But generally speaking, they're not closing. If anything, they're still opening up. And I think more of them will continue to open up as high-end operators from across the world see the success of venues like Sushi Show, which moved from Honolulu to New York. The Honolulu location is still open. And as they see these restaurants doing well. So at least at the super high end, there are not too many restaurants. We may feel like some of those places are disproportionately covered, especially as people like, me and you can't afford to, eat at these places every single day of the week. It would be nice to have a $500 sushi meal, twice a month. Maybe if we were, oligarchs. But such is not the case. So at the high end, culturally, you could argue that maybe there are too many of these places. But from a financial or demand perspective, these places seem to be doing okay.
Yeah, well, it's a good answer, and it's obvious too if you look at like the messaging from banks. They want 5 days in the office. Legal operators want 5 days in the office. It's Midtown is busy as ever, and not just with tourists, but with people actually in the offices. And clearly, if these high earners are in the office 5 days a week, there's going to be a lot of T&E budget given to these restaurants at the high end. So that makes a lot of sense. I want to zoom out one more time and ask you a big question about the food media landscape. You were laid off from Eater, and it's clear that the world of restaurant reviewing is getting smaller and smaller, and fewer publications are supporting a full-time critic, and even the places supporting full-time critics are rolling back some of the responsibilities, throwing those individuals into more feature reporting, into more listicles, which is not bad at all. And I think we're a very healthy environment creatively, but financially, these publications aren't supporting full-time critics. Do you see the restaurant review format changing over the next 5 years?
Maybe. I certainly think things are better in the food media landscape than they were, say, a year and a half ago. When I was laid off. You have the New Yorker doing longer reviews than they ever have under Helen Rosner, who I know won a Beard Award for her recent efforts. You have New York Magazine hired a critic, Matthew, who does great work. In addition to Matthew, you have Tammy, who continues to do amazing work. At Eater, you still have Robert Sietsema. In addition to Robert Sietsema, you occasionally have Eater doing these great scene reports of critically minded takes on restaurants throughout the city by people who aren't traditionally critics, which I think is a good thing because it helps give people more voices. And we saw, I think Emma Orlo had a really fun take on Frogs Club in her scene report. And so things are, you didn't necessarily have that a year ago. In addition to that, on Substack, and I know it's not a traditional media publication.
It's getting there.
It's getting there. You have folks like me. You have, Mahira Rivers, who has an excellent Substack about desserts in New York. Charlotte Druckman, who has her own Substack, mostly about baked goods and sweet things. So again, not necessarily traditional criticism across the fronts. But I think things are a lot better than they were a year ago. And of course, the New York Times is going to have a new critic probably sometime in the next 6 months. But however long that takes, you have Priya and Melissa doing interim critic work. I think Priya just reviewed Bungalow. She gave it 3 stars. A really, kind of smart contextual review about the state of modern South Asian cuisine.
Really
in New
like
York.
that one.
Yeah, really good stuff. And Melissa just reviewed, I think, Lola's. In the Flatiron Nomadish area. I would say right now we're in a much better place than they were a year ago. I mean, there are things I would like to see change in the critical landscape. I think it would be great, just as Eater, the way Eater used to have 2 critics, me and Robert Sietsema. I think it would be lovely if the New York Times had multiple voices there as well. A dual critic system, because it's a really huge job for any one person, and because the more you can just give more voice to all the great journalists out there, just as the New York Times used to have, the Hungry City column or $25 and under. It would be lovely to see them return to that, because I think people love different points of view, and because one person can only, cover so much, and different people bring, quite obviously different perspective based on where they come from. I don't think there are a lot of people who could have written that review the way Priya did, and so the more that, and then we had Melissa write, one of the subsequent reviews from the point of view of, her her skills as a recipe writer and as a cookbook author, I believe. And so I think with that system they have right now with these two people from these two different points of view, I think that's awesome. I realize your question was somewhat different, but I think things are improving, and I think what I will say is it's not the worst thing in the world that places like the New York Times are doing these cool listicles, top 100, top 25 restaurants in different cities around the country. I mean, they're trying to compete with the eaters and the infatuations of the world, but they're not retreating from traditional criticism either.
Yeah, you've laid out a really, really fine case about the health of print media, and print meaning generally words on a page, either on Substack or in the printed New York Times. And I fully see what you're saying, and I really do think we have a healthy, diverse crop of critics in New York City, and I love to hear that. I will push back slightly and just say, to me, it seems like with all that said, there is a sea change happening in the way people get their restaurant reviews. And I say reviews with big air quotes. And a big part of that is TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, everything from the back of the seat pizza reviews to people going and having really detailed accounts of meals. And if you read any headline, you've also have AI playing in this mix and restaurant recs coming from AI, scraping from these print outlets, but doing it for free and not really compensating the outlets. So let's ask you, let's start with TikTok. Do you see TikTok as an existential threat to the print restaurant critic?
No, I don't. I mean, listen, why do people go onto platforms like TikTok or any new and emerging form of media? And I'm not even sure TikTok qualifies as new or emerging right now, given its ubiquity. And the same could be said for Instagram stories. They do it because they probably want to see their voices out there because they don't feel their voices are being represented. They're usually filling in from some sort of power vacuum. And again, that power vacuum is probably caused a little bit by traditional print media and digital media retreating right now from whatever it is they've been doing because things are a little bit tough in both the digital media sphere and the print media sphere. Obviously, what someone like Keith Lee or Muslim Foodies, I think Muslim Foodies I think they do a pretty nice job at covering the halal restaurant scene in New York. What they're doing, of course, is not criticism. What they're doing is kind of very short form reviewing. I mean, there's reviewing, there's criticism. Reviewing is, broadly speaking, in the context of our conversation, is going to a place and trying to help people make an informed economic decision and hopefully provide a little bit of, context as well. Here's a new modern Korean restaurant and here's where the chef comes from. And maybe here's what they're doing a little bit differently than someone else. That's not criticism, that's reviewing. Criticism is something entirely different. A good review should have criticism. And when I say criticism, I don't mean this is good, that's bad. I mean criticism from the academic pursuit of trying to reckon maybe with competing strains of thoughts, refuting bad ideas, advancing good ideas, and maybe even trying to, track a trend that other people haven't tracked before. There are a lot of modern Korean restaurants in New York City right now. Here's what it means for the state of modern fine dining, and here's how other restaurants are adopting some of the ingredients, techniques, and ethos of those modern Korean fine dining restaurants. And I'm going to put that in my larger restaurant review. You don't need to do that in every single restaurant review, but I think a good review should have elements of criticism. It should have elements of reporting. And it should help people make an economic decision. What the people are doing on TikTok is very narrow. I think some of it's good. I think some of it is, reductively speaking, not good. I wish it had more context. And what troubles me isn't the existence of these TikTok critics. And again, I haven't devoted a lot of thought to someone like Keith Lee. I'm sure they probably bring a lot of attention to restaurants that maybe mainstream critics aren't necessarily giving a lot of attention to. And that's probably a really good thing. And the same could be said for, again, Muslim Foodies on TikTok. But I think the more troubling thing is when people exclusively look to a quote-unquote TikTok critic to get their dining inspiration, to get their dining picks, rather than looking towards print or digital media, because like I said, traditional criticism or reviewing through print media provides a much bigger and much more intellectual picture, and I think that's a cool thing. And we should also talk about the infatuation of Michelin at some point, because they're both also moving into the power vacuum that is being caused by the retraction of print and digital media, and I think that's not always a good thing, the way that either Michelin or Infatuation are expanding themselves.
So you're saying that the power vacuum is these outlets entering into a world where they're not necessarily giving these restaurants the rigor and really the art of real criticism, which has been the long history of restaurant reviewing criticism being said. And you are saying that their entry into this world is a net negative.
I don't want to say it's a net negative. I think there just has to be balance. I mean, again, if Keith Lee goes to a restaurant that regular critics aren't reviewing, either contextually or critically or whatever, and brings attention to that place and gives that restaurant an economic benefit and tells people about the restaurant that they otherwise wouldn't have known about, I think that's a net positive. And same goes for Muslim soup foodies and a few of these other TikTokers or what have you. I think the downside is that when people neglect traditional media, here's another way of putting it. I think one of the cool things about good restaurant criticism, you read a review by Pete Wells or by Matthew at New York Magazine or Robert Sietsema or my old reviews at Eater, is that we like to be in conversation with one another. So many occasions I would disagree with what Pete Wells says, and I would quote his review, and they say, here's why I think he's wrong, or here's how I disagree with them. No one's really right or wrong in these situations. These are just,
of course.
The old expression, there's two economists in a room, four opinions. No one agrees with these sort of things. We all disagree. That's, what we as critics do. But we're in conversation with each other. You don't see those same conversations happening at the level of TikTok. And again, I realize people aren't going up to TikTok in the morning so that Keith Lee can quote four different critics and try to refute all of them. They're going because they want to be delighted by someone who delights them and provides them with good advice. Again, I think that's a good thing. But you're losing this larger conversation that's happening between intelligent writers who disagree with each other. And if you believe that intellectual discourse and listening to different opinions makes you have better opinions yourself and creates a more delightful environment for deciding to try to where to go out to eat at night, I think you're losing something by entirely focusing on that. The same, incidentally, can be said for, and again, I'm not trying to really jump on anyone here, but you read The Infatuation, and you read Michelin, and you're not getting, what's going on from a cultural or contextual perspective the way you're getting it if you're reading Eater, Grub Street, or the New York Times. And I realize that what The Infatuation or Michelin does, what they do, I mean, they're not doing criticism, they're doing reviewing in the strictest sense. And so they would probably argue that it's not our game to be part of that larger conversation. We're just giving our very kind of, narrow take. But given how big those two organizations are, I wish they thought more broadly about their jobs, because they ultimately do hire and employ very smart people who are probably very good at their jobs, who have a lot of opinions, who I think would make this food media landscape a lot better.
If they were given the word count.
If they were given the
word count and given the ability to stretch and give this cultural context, historical context, all the great things that we appreciate in fine restaurant criticism. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to transition and talk a little bit about money in terms of your business, the Low Times on Substack. Ryan, is it financially sustainable what you're doing now? Because you really do go out and spend a lot of money on restaurants if you read your Substack.
I do spend a lot of money on restaurants. It's a little bit frightening sometimes. Not as much as I used to when I had a full-time expense account at a full-time job. Generally speaking, any given review I write costs anywhere from, say, $300 to $800 or $900. Not a lot of them cost $900. That would be more like a sushi show, which is, I'm obviously not going to a sushi show 3 times and writing a review. I went there once. Is it financially sustainable? It's a great question. I would say that depends on your point of view and depends on your accounting method. Let's just say I'm not yet in a position where I'm ready to buy a seized Russian oligarch yacht in the Mediterranean, nor am I buying, fancy homes on the Gold Coast of Long Island. But my site is not underwater. It is profitable. Again, what does profitable mean? It's not, all of my reviews pay for themselves. At least I would say on a 2 to 3 month rolling basis. So yes, the site is profitable. All the meals pay for themselves, and I get to use a little extra to pay for some of my student loans. Not yet in a position to expand, but everything pays for itself, and that's a huge key, because if I was in the red and the meals were not paying for themselves, I would be hemorrhaging cash and I'd be in a lot of trouble really fast. So I'm lucky that thanks to my subscriptions, everything I don't see any of this. All my meals are paid for. So I'm very grateful for that. Now, does that undervalue my labor a little bit? Yeah, but I'm willing to ride that wave until things become better, and you establish yourself a little more. But again, I'm okay with that.
So let me ask you, how do you interact with your readers, if you do at all? And I guess, how do you generate more subscribers, paid subscribers to the Low Times? Because it seems if you're going to do a subscription model, you're going to have some churn, obviously, every month. Every month that you have the notice that you're resubscribing, people are going to decline for a variety of reasons. But you have to grow, obviously, somewhat just to maintain the subscriber. But you, of course, want to grow. It seems extremely difficult. And so the fact that you're sustainable, major props to you. But how do you actually build a community and grow your audience?
By writing more, which is always difficult because I only have so much bandwidth to write. And you try to move into different coverage areas, and some of them work, and some of them didn't. I run a podcast right now. I tried to launch my own podcast. The sheer effort it took to I'm not a laissez-faire podcast producer.
Yeah.
I'm a pretty hands-on person, and so that took a lot of effort, and it didn't really work out because I just didn't have the time. But I've been trying to move into other coverage areas. I've been working pretty hard on expanding into edibles and THC because I view that as an undercovered area around the country. THC drinks themselves are a $500 million a year business. Edibles are also something that people do a lot of. I think a recent survey found that there are more daily marijuana users in this country than there are daily drinkers. And in as much as both of those things intersect with the restaurant world, a lot of us eat edibles in order to make food taste better, just as a lot of people pair wine with food because they think it matches well with good cuisine. It's something that I write about, and without getting into the Excel spreadsheet of what works and what doesn't, writing about cannabis has been one of the greatest, this is a weird term, growth areas for me. And that makes me incredibly grateful that I can kind of bring a voice and bring a critical voice to the cannabis sphere that I think is largely lacking in the in food media in general, and I'm hoping that inspires more people to write about that, because again, I think especially as young people cut back on alcohol, I think that's something that we're all going to be paying a lot more attention to.
Yeah, I think there's extreme white space with cannabis coverage, and giving your editorial rigor towards this big topic and this growing topic is obviously going to be a successful operation. I'm going to zoom in now and talk about some specific stories that you've been working on, and one recent feature that I just loved it. I dove in, and you wrote about the modern slice scene in New York City. You mentioned that $5 is becoming the norm for slices, but still, even if we were used to the dollar slice and now we're at $5, that's a big jump. It still is a very much an affordable luxury in this fine city of pizza. And I want to ask you first, you used to write in pizzerias. You mentioned that in the piece when you're at Eater. What draws you to pizzerias, to write in, to hang out in, to work in?
Pizzerias are places that I grew up loving. I was born in New York City, raised on Long Island, or in Long Island, as some people like to say.
Yeah.
On is the more grammatically correct form.
Right.
It's like many other teenagers, kids. You grow up playing video games and eating pizza before school, after school, usually after school. And so I was probably just drawn to that as for lack of a better term, a third place when I became a working professional. And so I worked out of a place called Corner Slice in Hell's Kitchen, which is now closed. It was Michael Bergman's really good pizzeria. I think he's hoping to relocate.
Ivan Orkin was involved in the project as well.
Ivan Orkin was involved in the project.
Very, very good pizza.
I think some of the city's best in terms of, at the time it ranked with, Scars and probably shortly thereafter Mama's too, as, the beginning part of the new wave slices. And so I worked either out of there, Corner Slice in Hell's Kitchen, or out of Sullivan Street Bakery by Jim Leahy. Again, both are equal parts bakery as they are pizzerias. These are not traditional, Long Island, New Jersey style nostalgic slice shops with, Kool-Aid colored booths and arcade games. These are places where you get something more expensive. Maybe you get really good coffee. Maybe you get, really nice viennoiserie. I can never pronounce that word.
You said it right from what my assessment. So
Okay, good. I always get nervous about that. But yeah, these are it felt like a good middle ground between the slice shops I grew up with and fancier restaurants and third wave coffee shops. And this was somewhere, and you can hear my Long Island accent come out when I say coffee. But in between those two things, this felt like a comfortable place for me to open up my laptop and work and eat good food for not a whole lot of money and be inspired.
You've laid out what makes a modern pizza slice shop in New York, and you have written a terrific roundup, using a very general term, but an assessment of the scene. So, Ryan, give us a few of the places that really strike you as being the top of the pizza mountain right now.
So the top of the pizza mountain right now, probably, I think a lot of people think about Massimo Leveglia's. Forget the pronunciation, his pizzeria, a small growing chain called Lindustry, with two locations, one in Williamsburg, the other in the West Village. Really amazing dough, super light. I believe it's mostly naturally leavened. Readers can fact check themselves. Known for his burrata slice, probably more than anything, a traditional New York cheese slice, but topped with burrata, which is nice because a lot of traditional slices they use semi-dry or aged mozzarella, which has like a nice salinity to it. The burrata acts as this kind of clean and cooling counterpoint to the warmer, saltier cheese, and it's really lovely. They also have a really good truffle slice. Not in the sense of, a lot of people hear the word truffle in a non-fine dining sense, and they think of truffle oil fries.
We think about MIA and truffle fries. That's all we think about.
That's precisely, and it's, this noxious scent coming out of whatever you're eating. But he uses a really good, I think, probably Italian truffle paste. It's super tasty. Mama's, too, is doing some really lovely stuff, especially at their West Village location. I was never quite fond of the Upper West Side location. I thought the service was, this is not something I usually talk about. The service was a little bit gruff.
I fully agree. It was not an enjoyable experience to dine there.
Not an enjoyable experience, at least not for me. But again, not something I usually talk about. But I found the location in the West Village to have happy people working there, and it made me happy. And I think what they're doing there is pretty cool in terms of not just classic New York City slices, but really innovative New York City slices, vodka slices, pear and gorgonzola, stuff that you wouldn't find elsewhere. And again, I realize the vodka slice is a staple of like Staten Island pizza making. This is a much different vodka slice. This is like a layer of pillowy ricotta with incredibly creamy sauce on top in a crispy, crunchy square. So I think the new Mama's too is a happy place serving really good stuff. So those two are two of the ones that really stand out to me.
Very much enjoy. I'm going to link to it in the show notes. Definitely make sure to subscribe and read the full assessment of the city. As an aside, I always put these out there when asked by guests. My two favorite slices as of now are F&F in South Carroll Gardens and L&B Spumoni Garden. What do you think about those picks? Please disagree.
No, great picks. And I've dined at L&B Spumoni, but not as much as I should. I would say F&F is cool. I really like and you tell me, I really like their clam slice. And my thing is, I think more folks. Listen, I realize we don't live in New Haven. This is New York. But I would say that F&F has a pretty tasty clam slice. And what's nice about it is that while some places really emphasize the brine, they emphasize the garlic butter. And I think anyone who gets kind of baked or grilled clams in New York goes for the clams as much for the garlic butter as they do for the brine, and that's what F&F does a good job in that sense.
Agree. You're going to definitely, if the balance of garlic butter is there and it's not overpowering, some of those New Haven joints will go a little hard with it, but I agree, it's not really about the clams, it's about the butter. I like their Sicilian a lot. I know it's gotten some heat from some critics, and I really like their sage sausage, which is a tip to the Frankie's iconic pasta. So Those are my favorites.
I used to, back in the day before the pandemic, I would get the cavatelli with sage, brown butter, and sausage at Frankie's Spuntino, and I would take the pasta and I would dip it in the sauce from the pork braciole, and that was always really tasty.
Well, Frankie's is still one of my favorite restaurants. Still very busy and great place. Let's talk about the high end sushi. I like that you brought it up earlier, and you've given it a lot of airtime on the low times. And I want to get a sense first from diners to spend $500 to $900 on a meal. This is for many, myself included, very, very, very special meal. So broadly speaking, what is so exciting about going to a New York omakase?
Gosh, that's a tough question. I mean, listen, yes, these are great restaurants, and I think even someone who doesn't necessarily know a lot about sushi could eat at a $500 spot and a $100 spot, and would ultimately come to the conclusion that the $500 spot is better. These are cool places serving immaculately aged, crafted, sliced fish served over vinegared rice with excellent service, and just doing really cool stuff in terms of sourcing fish that otherwise you couldn't get at a regular, $50 to $100 quick omakase spot or a la carte sushi spot. But I also want to emphasize, and this is one of the things I talk a lot about when I talk about high-end sushi, at least within the class of places where you're going to spend $500 to $1,000 per person, and there are a lot of these places, it's not necessarily about better versus best. It's more about what you're in the mood for, and it's about style. This isn't about, and this is a comparison I used before, this is not about economy class versus business class. This is about choosing a different type of wine. Just because you like Alsatian Riesling over German Riesling doesn't mean that the Alsatian Riesling is ultimately better. And so what you have to ask yourself and what you want to think about when you're spending this much money on sushi is, do you want something more creative and spicy? In which case, maybe you go to Shuko. Do you want something super ultra traditional with a shorter menu? In which case you go to Naz. Do you want something with a longer menu with slightly more innovative preparations that maybe you haven't seen in New York, where the sushi and the small plates are interspersed with each other? Then you want to go to Naz 17 or Sushi Show. And so these are some of the things you want to think about when spending this much money. Not necessarily about better versus best. It's about what are you in the mood for. And if none of those things sound great to you, then you don't necessarily need to spend this much money on any of these places. Because, again, even if there's a distinct difference between the $500 spot and the $50 spot, there are also a lot of great spots in between where you don't have to spend $1 billion and you can still get a really good meal. And again, I would say Shuko is probably one of those where dinner is only fake air quotes around the word only, $270 or $275. Yeah, $270 as opposed to spending, $646 at Yoshino.
That's a hit on the Amex right there.
That is a hit on the Amex.
Just to see if it's two of you, just to see those numbers. But you laid out why high-end sushi is exciting. It's entertaining. These places are cool. The spaces are, and I think species diversity is a really great point that we don't talk about enough. If you really want to learn about what sushi culture is like in Japan and in Los Angeles and in London, places that have great sushi cultures, species diversity is what it's all about.
And I think one of the cool things about the two places I really love these days, Naz 17 and Sushi Show. Naz 17 is $475 or $460 service included. Sushi Show, I think, is $450 service included. Neither restaurant emphasizes bluefin tuna or bluefin toro in their regular menu. That doesn't mean you won't see it, but it's not the toro fest that you get at a lot of other restaurants, which I think is a good thing, both for sustainability reasons and also for reasons of let's have an interesting meal. Because if every single sushi restaurant ends or begins with the akami lean tuna, then the bluefin toro, chu toro, and then the otoro, which is the fattiest, things become a little bit boring. And there have been times where I've had I've been to a bunch of high-end sushi restaurants, and sometimes they seem a little more similar to each other than they should be. And so what you get, at least for me at Naz 17 and at Sushi Show, is a little more outside the mainstream in terms of, getting really cool fish that maybe you wouldn't see elsewhere. Just personally, I'm a big fan of golden ice snapper.
Let's talk about Karima a little bit. I had Kate Castanon from Bon Appetit, and that restaurant in New York has made it onto their best new restaurant list. And I've not been. I'm interested in the concept there of this prefix about $100. I also peeked on Resing, and there was like so many spots available, and it makes me just want to talk about them more when maybe the general public hasn't caught up to this restaurant doing remarkable things. You wrote about it recently. I'd love to get your take on Karima.
Karima is an amazing modern Mexican restaurant. I believe it's populated by Contra, or at least one Contra Wild Air alum. And I think what's interesting about it and what's great about it is it's a chance to have a fine dining experience that won't, it's not a half paycheck restaurant. It's like you said, about $100. Loosely inspired, I believe, by I think northern Mexican, Chihuahuan, Sonoran cuisine. I believe off the top of my head. But it's also but Karima is also international in its ethos. It adopts, I believe, quite a few Japanese and modern French techniques off the top of my head. So yeah, you can get a beautiful, I believe, Sonoran-style oversized flour tortilla that's cooked on the back of a bowl, almost like a large scallion pancake, served with, I think, Recado Negro butter or something like that. That's really super delicious. But when I dined there, at least in the early days, you can get also a really lovely sashimi platter. With a lot of good raw oysters served with, salsas and other things that were sometimes Japanese and sometimes Mexican. And I think Karima is good in and of itself, and it's the way it tips its hat to regional Mexican cuisine, but it's also exciting for its international ethos. But it's also, from a macro perspective, interesting on a different level in that it speaks to New York's modern Mexican cuisine. We often talk about, modern Korean cuisine in terms of those restaurants really being the new vanguard, the creative vanguard of the city's fine dining scene, the way French cuisine used to be or is. And a lot of people have written smart pieces about that. Pete Wells and I think ELX Jung, I think, from New York Magazine. But I think modern Mexican cuisine continues to be maybe slightly overlooked in that regard. Maybe not overlooked because it doesn't have the same numbers as modern Korean cuisine does. But I mean, listen, Mexican cuisine in New York has long been trying to break free of the burden of authenticity and the shackles of being cheap.
And Los Angeles, just throw that in. It's always the comparison to Los Angeles.
And also the comparison to Los Angeles, where there's probably or is a larger and deeper Mexican population. But we've seen that improve in New York with Cosme by Enrique Olvera reaching its 10-year anniversary, a super expensive restaurant, about $150 per person. But now that we have a Cosme, we have a Karima, we have Atla also by Enrique Olvera.
Empayón, we got to mention Empayón too.
We mentioned Empayón and Alex Stupak with his Mexican and American restaurants was groundbreaking in getting people to think outside of the box in terms of Mexican cuisine. All of these places are setting the framework for Mexican creators to do more ambitious and expensive things, and I think that's super important for the diversity of cuisine and bringing new voices to contemporary fine dining in New York. So I think what Karima is doing is super, super cool.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I'm really looking forward to booking there this fall and reporting back on my findings on this show. Ryan, on This Is Taste, we ask guests about their discerning taste. So to close this interview, here's a little rapid fire. Fast and Furious taste check. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
The best fruit.
Best fruit is coconut.
How do you like your coconut served?
I could have it in a flan. I could have it toasted. I could have it shaved. I could have it savory. I could have it sweet. I could have it in a gelée or a kind of a South Indian style gel. Which I had in the San Francisco Bay Area. I think a restaurant called El Capra or something like that not too long ago. Coconut is one of my very first taste memories. It makes me really, really happy. The smell, the aroma, the texture, everything about coconut makes me happy.
The worst vegetable?
Artichoke.
Yeah, so tell me, I always have a tough hang during that 6-week period in the spring, but why don't you like it?
It's just not, listen, someone's going to be listening to this and Ryan Sutton hates what I love. And listen, as a critic, I like to think I can write about artichokes academically and intellectually and express joy about them. It's just not for me. I don't like how they don't taste good with wine. I don't like them.
Got it, buddy. The best dessert?
Best dessert, probably creme caramel or flan, as a lot of us call it. I grew up eating flan creme caramel. I love the egginess. I love the texture. It's light. It's sweet. It's not too sweet. It doesn't fill you up too much. Yes, flan makes me very, very happy.
A restaurant you are most excited to visit in the world?
Oh, gosh. Lots of restaurants I want to eat at. If I had to pick a real brand name one, forgive me. I think we all want to eat at Asador Etxebarri.
Yeah.
In the Basque Country. Impossible to get into. More practically, I want to eat at a new, I believe it's a tasting menu restaurant in Bogota called El Chato. I don't know how new it is, but I'd love to eat there.
Your favorite cookbook of all time?
Favorite cookbook of all time is Claudia Rodin's The Food of Spain. It is encyclopedic. I first started reading it, I think, when I was reviewing La Vara shortly after Hurricane Sandy, when I was a Bloomberg News food critic. And it's just an absolutely amazing encyclopedic work that documents a cuisine that doesn't a variety of cuisines throughout the Iberian Peninsula that, from a regional perspective, that don't always get the attention they should. Claudia Rodin's The Food of Spain is an absolutely amazing work. And I used to joke that I would like to take a sabbatical from my job when I did have a full-time job just to study The Food of Spain by Claudia Rodin.
Do you have a favorite recent cookbook discovery?
Yeah, I would call this one, I mean, we all like Cush Bouchard's American, but if I can be more interesting, because I'm sure a lot of people have mentioned that, and that, of course, is probably the most recent. I really like, this is an interesting, I try not to name too many chef cookbooks, but Gabriela Camara's, is that how you say her name? My Mexico City Kitchen. I continue to go back to her writings on tacos for what makes a good taco. A lot of people read cookbooks to replicate a specific recipe. I read cookbooks for inspiration on how to think about cuisine, to think about food critically in my job as a critic. And her writings on tacos, or what makes a good taco proportionally and intellectually, is something I go back to again and again and again.
I love that pick. We published it here maybe 5 years ago. I feel like it's been one of those great books that hasn't necessarily gotten the credit it deserves for your exact points, and also just the recipes that just are very cookable. And I love that pick. Great job. Your favorite city outside America to visit for food?
I'm going to say two. Paris, just because, hate to be boring, but the diversity and accessibility of amazing food in Paris these days is, I think, at an all-time high. When we think of cool New York City restaurants right now, from a Karima or a Contra, I mean, we're getting that from Paris in terms of this ambitious food in a stripped down setting that you don't have to wait too long to get into. But if I had to pick another city, I'd pick Bogota because just lots of cool young chefs, sometimes having studied in the U.S. or Europe. Not that they have to do that, and mixing those techniques and inspirations from abroad with their indigenous style of cooking in Colombia. And Colombia, of course, is representative of many different cultures, whether it be Hispanic, indigenous, or the cuisine of Black people in Colombia. There's so much interesting stuff going on there. And so I really want to get back to Bogota.
Last one, your favorite sandwich?
Favorite sandwich? Tough. Probably, I'm going to be simple. The sandwich I eat more than any is the Cubano. Cuban sandwich, medianoche. Slowly cooked pork, ham, mustard, pickles. I personally put a little bit of mayo on mine. Pressed, really hot, really crispy. Having that while listening to live music and drinking a mojito, we're in a good place if that's what Ryan Sutton is doing on a given evening.
What an evening that would be. Thank you, Ryan, for joining This Is Taste. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me again, Matt. I appreciate it.
This Is Taste is hosted by Eliza Abarbanel and me, Matt Rodbard. The show is produced by Shalia Harris and Pat Stango and edited by Clayton Gumbert. Theme music by Steve Rydell. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for updates on all cool things that are happening.